Lebanon entered 1943 with a question that had followed it for more than a generation. How long could a country function under a mandate that promised guidance yet delivered hesitation? The year opened on a scene marked by shortages, long administrative delays, and a population increasingly aware that the promises of 1936 had disappeared. The treaty that might have opened a path toward independence had never been formally approved in Paris, and its absence hung over every ministry ledger and every parliamentary session. It shaped a political mood marked not by rebellion, but by exhaustion, a sense that a system designed after the First World War no longer recognized the pressures of the Second. Across Beirut, the workings of government moved at a strained and uneven pace. Officials who had once cooperated smoothly with their French counterparts now found themselves caught in layers of wartime orders. Strict rationing, fuel shortages, and the lasting impact of Vichy-Free French rivalry slowed everything from court decisions to basic budgeting. Decisions that should have taken days now stretched on for weeks. Lebanese ministers grew frustrated not because the mandate openly opposed them, but because it seemed unable to act consistently at all. That inconsistency deepened after 1941, when Free France took control of the Levant from Vichy forces. Charles de Gaulle had declared that the mandate would continue until the end of the war, yet he inherited administrators and systems that did not fully answer to him. Some offices remained loyal to old rules, others to new aims, and many balanced precariously between the two. Lebanese ministries, dependent on French signatures for critical functions, faced shifting instructions that seemed to change with each diplomatic cable arriving from London or Algiers. It was a puzzle of how to govern, and one that only heightened the sense that the mandate no longer understood the land it governed. Into this environment came an election that would alter Lebanon's political future. In the spring of 1943, voters delivered a clear mandate of their own. They elected Bechara el-Khoury as president and brought Riad al-Solh into the role of prime minister. Both men had long argued that Lebanon deserved a more balanced relationship with France, one rooted in partnership rather than guardianship. Their campaign was not a call to cut ties, but to modernize them, to update a political arrangement conceived in the wake of one global conflict to fit the shape of another. In towns from Tripoli to Byblos, their message connected not because it was radical, but because it felt overdue. The months that followed saw Lebanon's political energy shift from quiet negotiation to a more public form of confidence. Rallies drew larger crowds than the country had seen in years. Newspapers, though still subject to French censorship, found ways to voice the growing mood of confidence. For the first time, the possibility of constitutional change no longer seemed a distant idea, but a realistic goal. The Lebanese government believed that the mandate could be revised from within its own legal framework, through careful amendment rather than open confrontation. At the center of this effort was a careful internal negotiation that would later be known as the National Pact. Though never written as a single formal document, it reflected conversations between Lebanon's leading communities, particularly Maronite and Sunni leaders. Al-Solh understood that independence required not only loosening foreign control but ensuring internal balance. His dialogue with el-Khoury established an understanding. Lebanon would affirm its Arab direction, while maintaining close ties with Western partners. Neither isolation nor one-sided foreign alignment would define the republic. Instead, living together would. This delicate but important agreement strengthened the government's hand as it prepared to challenge the built-in powers of the mandate. Yet even as Beirut took cautious steps toward constitutional revision, the French High Commission watched with rising concern. Jean Helot, appointed to oversee the Levant, believed that altering the mandate during wartime risked unsettling the region. From his offices in the hilltop residence at Deir al-Qamar, he warned that any one-sided action by the Lebanese parliament would be treated as a direct challenge to French authority. To Helot and many Free French officers, the mandate was not simply administrative, it was strategic, tied to France's global standing in the changed world emerging from the war. British officials observed these tensions with interest. Reports from Cairo and the Middle East Command questioned whether France intended to honor earlier promises of self-government. London had no desire to see instability in the Levant, especially while the North African campaign still cast its shadow. American diplomats shared similar doubts, not out of hostility toward France, but because they believed that post-war rebuilding would demand clarity, not uncertainty, in the region's political structures. By mid-1943, the stage had quietly been set. Lebanon possessed a government determined to revise the constitutional articles that granted the High Commissioner veto authority over budgets, treaties, and legislation. France wielded both its legal system and its military presence to enforce its view of the mandate. The Allies watched with a mixture of sympathy and caution, and in the narrow streets of Beirut, ordinary citizens sensed that a moment of decision was approaching, even if they could not yet name it. Throughout the summer, ministers drafted and redrafted possible amendments, carefully shaping them to avoid accusations of provocation. Their goal was to remove the articles that anchored French dominance, while maintaining the appearance, at least initially, of legal continuity. The strategy was quiet, rule-based, and almost bureaucratic, yet its results could be profound. If the amendments succeeded, Lebanon would redefine its relationship with the mandate. If they failed, the confrontation might unfold in ways no one could easily predict. As autumn approached, the government moved closer to presenting its proposals. Discussions tightened, drafts circulated in closed meetings, and the sense of expectation deepened. The mandate's patience thinned with each passing week, and its warnings grew clearer. Lebanon was preparing to act, France was preparing to respond, and somewhere in between, the fragile balance that had sustained 2 decades of uneasy working together began to tilt toward a clash neither side believed it could fully avoid. When the proposals finally neared completion, both governments understood that a decisive moment was only days away, though neither could yet see how sharply the moment would break. The new amendments were ready, and the High Commission was watching for the first move. For months, the Lebanese government had worked with quiet care, shaping amendments that would redefine the limits of the mandate without cutting ties entirely. By early November 1943, the drafts lay ready, clear, very legal, and carefully framed to avoid any suggestion of rebellion. They aimed to remove the articles that gave the French High Commissioner veto power over laws, foreign treaties, and the state budget. In Beirut, ministers believed they were acting within the constitution's rules. In Deir al-Qamar, the High Commission saw an attempted breakdown of its authority. On the morning of 8 November, the Lebanese Chamber of Deputies met in its stone building near the heart of Beirut. The gathering felt historic but controlled, a formal step in a long process. Members of Parliament rose one by one to cast their votes, and by mid-session, the chamber had agreed unanimously. The amendments would pass. With that vote, Lebanon's elected representatives declared that the state no longer required French oversight to function as an independent republic. News of the decision moved through Beirut quickly. Newspapers rushed to print brief notices before French censors stepped in. Ministers returned to their offices. Sure, they had acted within the law, but within hours, French authorities responded. High Commissioner Jean Helou declared the amendments null and void, announcing that no change to the constitutional relationship could be made without French approval. The mandate system, he insisted, remained untouched. What followed unfolded with a speed that worried Lebanese officials. The High Commission's legal department drafted an order to suspend Parliament's powers. French intelligence units began reviewing internal reports on ministers considered troublesome. Gendarmerie commanders received instructions to stand ready for operations that had not yet been clearly named. By nightfall, the tone of the crisis had shifted from administrative disagreement to something much sharper. Across Beirut, the signs of rising tension first appeared in the press. Newspapers that had planned long commentaries on the amendments suddenly found their pages missing entire columns. Several were shut down altogether. French officers visited editors in person, reminding them that any attempt to stir up public opinion would be treated as a violation of wartime security. Radios broadcasting political commentary were briefly taken off the air. The mandate chose to respond to constitutional change with pressure rather than discussion. Inside Lebanese ministries, the atmosphere grew heavier with worry. Ministers met in private rooms, trying to guess France's next step. They had expected criticism, perhaps even a temporary suspension, but the speed of the French reaction suggested something more forceful. Senior officials began drafting statements calling for calm, hoping to keep public emotions under control. At the same time, some quietly contacted British representatives to seek reassurance. London, they knew, did not support French overreaction, but it remained unclear whether Britain would step in. By the night of 9 November, rumours spread throughout the capital. Some said that ministers would be summoned to Deir al-Qamar for consultations. Others whispered about possible arrests. Heliou's aides denied everything, insisting that France only wished to preserve legal order. But inside the High Commission, plans were already in motion. Lists had been prepared, travel routes had been mapped, units were told to remain on alert for early movement. Lebanese leaders prepared for confrontation not through loud defiance, but through calm. President Bechara el-Khoury met quietly with advisers, emphasizing self-control. Prime Minister Riad al-Solh reviewed the constitutional logic behind the amendments, determined to show that Lebanon had acted within its rights. Their strategy was simple: prove legality, avoid panic, and force the mandate to explain whatever steps it planned to take next. But France did not appear ready to explain anything. Throughout 10 November, French vehicles moved between barracks and administrative centres, causing anxious speculation. British officers monitoring the situation reported to Cairo that tensions were rising, and American diplomats prepared notes expressing concern about the French handling of the political crisis. Yet none of these messages slowed the chain of events that was still building. That night, as officials across Beirut tried to understand the situation, the city felt held between normal life and rupture. Streets were calm, shops closed at the usual hour, and the coastline carried the same autumn wind it always had. But in political circles, the air was thick with the sense of an unseen decision hardening into action. In the early hours before dawn, drivers near the High Commission watched as military trucks started their engines. Orders moved quietly among gendarmerie officers. Units gathered not far from the capital, told to move with care and without noise. Few civilians were awake to see the preparations, and those who did could not guess their purpose. Yet inside ministerial homes across Beirut, some officials sensed that the moment they had hoped to avoid, the moment when constitutional debate turned into a test of force, was getting close. By first light, the trucks had begun to move. Their destination remained unannounced, their purpose unspoken. But the timing left little doubt. The mandate had chosen to answer the amendments not in Parliament, but in the streets. And as the convoy headed toward the heart of the capital, Lebanon prepared for a confrontation that would decide whether its bid for independence would move forward or be suddenly cut short. Dawn on 11 November broke quietly over Beirut, but the silence did not last. Long before most of the city woke, French gendarmerie units were already moving through the streets with practiced accuracy. Their orders were clear, their routes planned in advance. Within minutes, they reached the homes of Lebanon's highest officials. Doors were knocked, then pushed open. President Bechara el-Khoury, Prime Minister Riad al-Solh, and several ministers were taken into custody with little ceremony. No charges were read. No explanations were offered beyond the claim of mandate authority. It was a coordinated sweep designed to end the political dispute in a single morning. By the time the sun rose fully above the Mediterranean, the government of Lebanon had been removed from its own capital. The detainees were placed in military vehicles and driven eastward toward the Bekaa Valley. As word spread, those who saw the convoy from the roadside watched in disbelief. The president and prime minister were being transported not to a negotiation, but to Rashaya, an isolated fortress used in earlier decades as both a base and a prison. The mandate had chosen a symbol of confinement to answer a constitutional disagreement. News of the arrests moved faster than officials expected. Beirut, which had gone to sleep believing the crisis might still be contained within political debate, awoke to the realization that its leaders had been seized in the middle of the night. Shops opened late. Crowds gathered at street corners. University students left classes and marched toward the center of the city. What began as confusion hardened into anger, and anger into determination. Within hours, strikes spread through the capital. Businesses closed in solidarity. Clerics issued statements condemning the arrests. Groups from rural districts began their journeys toward Rashaya, hoping simply to stand near the fortress where their leaders were held. The government that the mandate had tried to silence with force suddenly found its voice multiplied among thousands of ordinary Lebanese who saw the arrests not as a simple political act but as an insult to national dignity. For the French authorities, the backlash was stronger than expected. Khoury believed that removing the political leadership would calm tensions and demonstrate control. Instead, the decision drew immediate attention from abroad. British officials in Beirut reported to London that the arrests risked sparking a wider uprising. In Cairo, Churchill received reports warning that the repression could damage Allied supply lines across the Levant, especially the movement of goods through the region's ports and highways. Britain had no wish to see unrest at a time when the war still demanded reliable cooperation from every territory in the Middle East. Sir Edward Spears, the British representative long critical of French stubbornness in the Levant, pressed the issue with unusual directness. Reports from the time describe him reminding French officers that the Levant was not a battlefield where administrative disputes could be settled by force. American diplomats, too, expressed concern that the arrests clashed with the Allied message of supporting self-determination. The mandate found itself increasingly isolated, defending an action that no longer seemed defensible to its own partners. Inside Rashaya Fortress, the detainees kept a steady calm. Their conditions were simple but not cruel days, marked by long conversations, shared meals, and quiet reflection on the extraordinary turn of events. Accounts differ on the exact details, but most agree that Khoury and Solh used the time to sharpen their positions, clarifying how Lebanon should move forward once they were freed. They believed the mandate's overreach would eventually turn against it, though they could not yet know how quickly that change would come. Outside the fortress walls, the meaning of Rashaya began to reshape public feeling. For many Lebanese, the arrest of leaders from different communities created an unexpected moment of unity. Sectarian lines that had long shaped political life softened, if only briefly, under the weight of a shared grievance. Students, shopkeepers, religious figures, and villagers from distant districts all found themselves united around a single demand: the release of their government and the return of national authority. What troubled France most was not the size of the protests, but their discipline. Demonstrations remained mostly orderly, showing that the public was not reacting out of chaos, but out of conviction. The story of keeping order, used to justify the arrests, collapsed under the evidence of a population behaving more responsibly than the mandate itself. Each passing day sharpened the contrast. A government held for acting through legal channels, and an administration insisting on control through force. By 20 November, the crisis had reached a breaking point. British pressure grew, supported by messages from Washington urging France to rethink its position. Reports suggest that even within the Free French leadership, divisions deepened. Some officers argued that keeping the arrests risked serious embarrassment. Others insisted that backing down would weaken France's authority in the region. De Gaulle, struggling for recognition in Europe, faced a hard choice: support his representative's tough line, or avoid diplomatic damage that could weaken Free France's standing among the Allies. On the ground in Lebanon, Khoury sensed that the situation was slipping out of his hands. The arrests, meant as a final show of authority, had instead become a burden. The protests grew. Strikes showed no sign of ending. The symbol of Rashaya grew stronger each day. Some kind of solution had to be found, yet no clear path appeared. By the evening of 21 November, messages moving between Beirut, Damascus, Cairo, and London showed that the mandate's position could no longer be kept. The balance had shifted. France risked standing alone against its own allies, and against a population that had made it clear it would not accept the removal of its leaders. The decision had not yet been announced, but the direction was clear. France would have to pull back from the position it had taken so firmly only 10 days earlier, and as ministers waited in their cells at Rashaya, unaware of the larger diplomatic storm building around them, the question hung over the fortress walls. If France gave way, would independence appear fully formed, or would a new struggle begin the moment they returned to Beirut? The morning of 22 November 1943 carried a tension that reached from Rashaya's stone corridors to the narrow streets of Beirut. For 11 days, Lebanon had existed in a strange pause, its government locked behind fortress walls, its people showing a unity rarely seen, and its mandate rulers facing an international reaction they had not expected. Yet, the final change came quietly. At some point in the early hours, French officials received instructions from above. The detainees were to be released. What followed happened with a speed that sharply contrasted with the drama before it. Orders reached Rashaya by mid-morning. Guards opened the doors that had held the president, the prime minister, and the ministers since 11 November. Outside the fortress, crowds of villagers who had camped nearby burst into celebration as the leaders came out. They had no speeches prepared, no formal declarations ready, only the relief of knowing that the political crisis had turned clearly in Lebanon's favor. In Beirut, excitement rose as news spread along cafes, tram stops, and marketplaces. When President Bechara el-Khoury and Prime Minister Riad al-Solh finally returned to the capital, the welcome surprised even mandate officials. Tens of thousands filled the streets not in defiance but in recognition. The release not only restored a government but also confirmed a principle many Lebanese had long believed but rarely seen, honored, that political authority flowed upward from the people, not downward from the mandate. Yet even in the joy of that day lay a quieter truth. Independence had been recognized, not completed. The mandate still controlled ports, airfields, troop barracks, rail depots, and customs posts. The administrative levers that shaped daily government budgets, foreign agreements, security approvals, were still partly tied to French oversight. The 22nd of November marked a breakthrough, but not the end of the struggle. Al-Solh moved quickly to shape the government's next steps. Within days, he put his cabinet back together, filling positions with figures he believed could show seriousness, at a time when Lebanon needed to prove maturity, not triumph. The crisis had won public enthusiasm, but the months ahead would demand order, stability, and the quiet work of building institutions. He knew that the mandate's pullback, though real, might slow or even stall if Lebanon appeared unable to rule itself well. The cabinet meetings that followed showed a leadership determined to strengthen authority within the limits of wartime reality. Ministers gave priority to control over the budget, customs income, and internal security, the very pillars that France had long guarded as signs of its mandate rights. Each function taken back became a quiet statement that Lebanon was not just celebrating independence, but exercising it. French officers in the Levant Command watched these moves with mixed feelings. Some accepted that the mandate's authority had been dealt a serious blow and could not be restored to what it once was. Others argued that France still held enough administrative tools to slow Lebanon's progress. These officers stressed the need for shared authority, a phrase that would soon become a source of annoyance for Lebanese officials. It signaled that France did not yet see the 22nd of November as a turning point, but as a temporary pause. The months that followed brought negotiations, delays, and periodic tensions. Lebanese ministries discovered that putting new policies into action still required signatures controlled by the High Commission. Communications with foreign governments needed French approval. Even the printing of certain government documents, long handled through mandate channels, now demanded new agreements. Independence had changed the political picture, but not yet the deeper bureaucratic ground beneath it. Still, something basic had shifted. The Lebanese public, having seen the events of November with their own eyes, now treated independence not as a hope but as a basic expectation. Civil servants started pushing for clearer lines of authority. Journalists approached domestic issues with sharper questions. Religious and political leaders who had once spoken carefully under mandate watch now spoke more openly about Lebanon's future. The symbolic victory at Rashaya had changed public confidence. French officials, meanwhile, understood that time was not working in their favor. Reports from London and Washington showed no desire to support renewed French control in the Levant. The Allied war effort depended on calm, and any attempt to roll back Lebanese gains risked fresh unrest. Even within Free France, debates grew sharper over how much authority could realistically be kept without harming the broader struggle for recognition in Europe. By mid-1944, the outlines of the post-Rashaya relationship had begun to appear. Lebanon would handle more of its own administrative affairs, but the mandate would keep control over key military and economic structures. It was an uneasy balance, neither full independence nor a return to the pre-crisis situation. Both sides sensed that another stage of negotiations was approaching, one that would ultimately decide whether the events of November would be remembered as a mere symbol or the first step toward full sovereignty. For Lebanon's leaders, the answer depended on keeping momentum without causing a new clash. Solh believed that showing steady, calm government was the strongest argument for speeding up mandate withdrawal. Khoury focused on diplomacy, knowing that foreign recognition mattered as much as internal control. Both men understood that the next challenge would not come from Rashaya or Beirut alone, but from talks with a France trying to manage its global position during a war that was slowly turning toward its end. And as the spring of 1944 unfolded, a quiet understanding settled over the political class. The events of 22 November had opened a door, but the path beyond it remained long, twisting, and closely watched by those who still believed the mandate could be reshaped rather than ended. Independence had been declared by the people and admitted under pressure, but the structures that defined real sovereignty still waited to be faced. By early 1944, Lebanon found itself moving through a political landscape still shaped by the mandate, but no longer defined only by it. The victory of November had given the Republic a moral authority it had never held before, yet much of its independence remained on paper. French officers continued to supervise ports, railways, and customs posts. Diplomatic messages still passed through the High Commission. For Lebanon to become a truly functioning state, it needed more than symbols. It needed recognition from the world and full control of the tools of government. The challenge was immediate and complex. France, still fighting for its own legitimacy after the turmoil of Vichy and the battles for free French authority, was unwilling to let go of what it saw as a crucial foothold in the Middle East. Many of its officials believed that the mandate could change shape rather than disappear, and that Lebanon's independence should unfold under French guidance. Lebanese leaders saw things differently. They believed that 22 November marked not a reform of the mandate, but its end. The two views met in negotiation rooms, diplomatic salons, and British and American briefing papers, and the struggle between them shaped every month of 1944. Lebanese diplomacy began with a careful adjustment of alliances. Britain and the United States had quietly opposed the November arrests, but neither wanted to push France into more profound humiliation. The war in Europe was still raging, and Allied unity remained the top priority. Lebanese officials, therefore, sought recognition through patient engagement rather than open confrontation. Solh worked to maintain constructive dialogue with British representatives in Cairo, stressing efficiency, stability, and Lebanon's readiness to take on full administrative responsibilities. Khoury focused on building relationships with American diplomats, whose support was becoming increasingly important in planning the post-war world. Yet every step forward faced resistance. French representatives insisted that Lebanon's foreign affairs could not be handled independently while the mandate remained in law. They argued that French oversight was still essential to ensure wartime stability and protect Lebanon's mixed religious and political system. Lebanese leaders answered that independence meant little if decisions affecting the republic still needed French approval. Negotiations became careful exercises in detail, with each side trying to draw the line around the other's authority. In the middle of these diplomatic exchanges, Lebanon saw another crucial truth. International recognition would require a formal break with its wartime neutrality. As long as it remained legally outside the conflict, Lebanon could not join the new international structures being planned, especially the emerging United Nations. Without membership, its independence might seem temporary, open to future argument. So, in February 1945, as the war clearly turned against Germany, Lebanon took a step that carried both symbolic and strategic weight. On 27 February, it declared war on Germany and Japan. The announcement was brief, almost quiet, yet its meaning was significant. It placed Lebanon clearly on the Allied side and positioned it to join the founding nations of the United Nations. The declaration also sent a message to France. Lebanon was now acting in foreign policy as a sovereign state, not as a mandate territory waiting for orders. France admitted the decision but did not welcome it. Some of its officials saw the declaration as a diplomatic move meant to weaken their position. Others saw it as something that could not be stopped, one more sign that Lebanon's political development had outrun the mandate's ability to contain it. The declaration also made French arguments in negotiation rooms more difficult, since they could no longer claim sole control over Lebanon's foreign relations. Economic negotiations soon became the next main battleground. Control over customs, currency systems, and port revenues had long been at the heart of the mandate's administrative power. To Lebanese leaders, these financial levers represented the core of state authority. A government that could not run its own economy could not honestly call itself independent. Throughout the second half of 1944 and into 1945, ministers pressed for control of coast and border customs posts and border crossings in the Bekaa Valley. French officers resisted, arguing that wartime supply, needs, and regional security required continued oversight. Each side claimed to be defending stability, yet neither could hide the larger question driving these talks. Who truly ruled the Republic? By the spring of 1945, outside forces began reshaping the debate. Free France, though gaining ground in Europe, increasingly depended on Allied support. In London and Washington, diplomats grew less patient with the idea of a long-lasting mandate in the Levant. They reminded French representatives that self-determination would be a key idea in the post-war world. This change in international tone strengthened Lebanon's bargaining position, even if French officials on the ground continued to resist. Still, the most dramatic change came not from written messages, but from events unfolding next door. Tension in Syria was rising. Negotiations there had hit the same dead ends Lebanon had faced. Demands for withdrawal, disputes over authority, and deep anger left from the Mandate era. The atmosphere grew increasingly unstable. Lebanese leaders closely followed developments, sensing that a regional crisis could shift the balance of power in their own negotiations. Even as these pressures came together, Lebanon continued to organize its institutions with quiet persistence. Ministries refined administrative procedures, expanded local authority, and built new channels of communication with foreign governments. Every act of government, from drafting budgets to issuing passports, became a statement of statehood. Independence was not yet fully recognized, but it was being lived more and more. By early May 1945, as Allied armies advanced deeper into Germany and the war in Europe neared its end, Lebanon's diplomatic position was stronger than at any earlier point in its modern history. It was a nation asserting itself in the international arena, pushing steadily against the remains of a mandate system whose base was cracking under global scrutiny. But the turning point would not come in Beirut. It would erupt in Damascus, where a clash between French forces and Syrian demonstrators sent waves through the region. The crisis there would become the trigger that brought the Lebanese-French dispute to its final key moment. And as Lebanon watched events across the anti-Lebanon mountains, one question grew sharper. If violence in Syria forced the world to act, would it finally break the mandate's hold over Lebanon as well? The war in Europe had barely taken its final breath when the Levant entered one of its most tense moments. On 10 May 1945, Damascus awoke to the sound of French guns. What began as clashes between demonstrators and French units turned into the shelling of important buildings, starting fires that lit the city's skyline. Reports differed in detail, but all told the same basic story. The mandate, in trying to take back control in Syria, had triggered a crisis that echoed across the region. For Lebanon, the effects were immediate. The confrontation next door was more than a local disturbance. It was a warning of what might happen if the unresolved tensions of 1943 to 44 rose again. News of the shelling traveled quickly to Beirut. Lebanese officials, already worried about the slow speed of French withdrawal, watched the events in Damascus with growing alarm. The crisis challenged the promises France had made again and again during talks. That calm could be kept while administrative and military control were slowly handed over. Instead, the crisis showed how quickly the mandate's presence could create conflict. The Lebanese cabinet met in urgent sessions. Not to intervene, Syria's struggle was its own, but to understand what the crisis meant for Lebanon's future. Public reaction showed a mix of solidarity and fear. Many Lebanese felt a connection with Syria's experience, remembering the arrests of November 1943 and the uncertainty that followed. Yet the images and reports coming from Damascus suggested a level of confrontation Lebanon had not faced. For ordinary citizens, the question was simple and stark. If France used force in Syria, what would stop it from doing the same in Lebanon if talks broke down? Across the region, diplomatic pressure increased. Winston Churchill, informed of the Damascus crisis through the British Middle East Command, sent one of his strongest messages to French authorities in the Levant. London demanded that the shelling stop at once and that French forces return to their barracks. The United States expressed similar anger, saying that the violence did not fit with the principles the Allies had claimed to defend throughout the war. International criticism put France on the defensive at a time when it was trying to rebuild its influence on the world stage. In this atmosphere, Lebanon found unexpected bargaining power. The crisis showed that the balance of power had shifted. Whereas France had once been able to enforce its decisions throughout the mandate, it now found itself limited by international oversight and dependent on Allied goodwill. Lebanese leaders realized they could use this moment to push for clearer promises, especially on troop withdrawal and the transfer of administrative control. Prime Minister Riad al-Solh called meetings to speed up Lebanon's negotiating stance. The government sent diplomatic signals stating that lasting calm in the Levant required a complete reshaping of French-Arab relations. The cabinet stressed that Lebanese independence was not merely symbolic or a temporary wartime change, but a fundamental shift that required formal recognition. The events in Syria strengthened the logic of this argument. If the mandate could spark conflict in one capital, the safest path to regional peace was to end it in both. French officials, shocked by the global reaction to Damascus, changed their tone in Beirut. While some commanders still insisted on a slow withdrawal schedule, others admitted that the crisis had changed the political landscape for good. Negotiators began softening demands for shared administration and instead focused on planning an orderly exit, hoping to keep some influence while avoiding further shame. This internal debate played out quietly, often through gentler diplomatic language and delayed orders, but it showed cracks in the last pieces of the mandate. Lebanon's talks now touched on questions that had remained open since 1943. Who controlled customs posts? Who commanded internal security? who spoke for the state in foreign affairs, and who held power over the budget. Each function carried both symbolic and practical meaning. France had once justified its oversight as necessary for regional safety, but after the Damascus crisis, that argument lost strength. Lebanese ministers returned again and again to the point that had driven their struggle since the constitutional amendments. Real independence required control, not partnership presented as supervision. The diplomatic channels widened. British representatives used firm but polite language to press France toward a clear schedule for withdrawal. American officials supported these messages, signaling that France could not afford another confrontation in the Levant while trying to rebuild its standing in the world. The new United Nations, still in its early stages, added another layer of watching eyes. It became increasingly clear that the direction of global politics favored the end of colonial rule, not its extension. As spring turned into summer, talks moved forward in careful steps. While Lebanon pushed for firm deadlines, France argued for staged withdrawal to avoid what it called a security vacuum. Lebanese officials responded that any problems arising from faster withdrawals could be addressed through regional cooperation and new administrative systems, independent of French control. Neither side got everything it wanted, but both began moving toward a compromise shaped as much by global opinion as by local bargaining. For the Lebanese public, the crisis in Syria remained a powerful reminder of how fragile independence could be. Beirut's newspapers carried stories of the damage in Damascus, alongside reflections on what was at stake in their own struggle. Civil society groups called for watchfulness. Religious leaders urged patience and unity. The sense of a shared regional fate, one built on the desire to step out from the shadow of outside control, deepened. By late 1945, talks between France, Lebanon, and their international partners were closing in on an agreement. The speed, though not yet fixed, had changed clearly. French resistance was fading, Lebanese persistence was bringing results, and international attention, sharpened by the Syrian crisis, was pushing both sides toward a final understanding. But even as diplomats drafted the outlines of a future without French troops, the last details remained unsure. Withdrawal would need transport, organization, and political will, all of which could still be slowed or challenged. Lebanon stood at the edge of a breakthrough, but the final step would decide whether independence would become a daily reality or remain a promise carved out of crisis. The beginning of 1946 found Lebanon standing between two eras. The political storm of 1943 had secured the idea of independence, and the Damascus crisis of 1945 had forced the world to accept its urgency. Yet the reality of sovereignty still depended on one last act, the departure of French troops and the transfer of the last administrative powers that the mandate had guarded for more than 20 years. Lebanon had declared itself independent. Now, it needed the physical signs of foreign rule to disappear. Talks resumed with new clarity after the turn of the year. Franco-Lebanese commissions, meeting in Beirut and Paris, worked through the details of withdrawal, not only troop movements, but the handover of barracks, armories, airfields, intelligence posts, and administrative offices. These discussions were less dramatic than the clashes of earlier years, yet they carried more weight. Independence would not be secured by declarations or symbolic releases, but by signatures, lists, and the quiet passing of authority from one set of hands to another. The agreements reached between December 1945 and 1 January 1946 set the basic plan. France agreed to pull its military forces out of Lebanon and Syria in stages, timed carefully to avoid shaking the region. This coordination, partly driven by Britain's insistence on regional stability, made sure that one withdrawal did not create a gap the other would struggle to fill. For Lebanon, the agreement marked the first time the end of the mandate became a practical reality rather than just a political goal. Through the first months of the year, the process unfolded with calm formality. French officers boarded transport ships in Beirut's port. Units stationed in the mountains came down to coastal barracks for inspection and transfer. Airfields that had long been controlled by French aviation units were prepared to be handed over to Lebanese authorities, who were themselves still building the capacity to manage them. At each step, teams from both nations checked property lists, updated inventories, and settled remaining questions about who controlled what. What might have been a dangerous transition instead took the shape of careful record-keeping. Within Beirut, the changing landscape could be felt in small but meaningful ways. Government buildings that had once shown French signs replaced them with Arabic script and Lebanese emblems. Ministries that had long depended on mandate middlemen began to issue orders on their own. Court officials, once required to consult the High Commission on certain legal matters, now handle cases without foreign oversight. The change was gradual but clear. Administrative strength was growing where little had existed before. Yet independence brought its own problems. Newspapers argued over the Republic's priorities. Should Lebanon focus on economic growth or legal reform? Should it build up its armed forces or center its efforts on regional diplomacy? Members of Parliament disagreed over the shape of the new state, aware that sovereignty brought responsibility as well as pride. Some worried that sectarian tensions might return once the unifying pressure of the mandate disappeared. Others believed that the National Pact, the informal understanding between Lebanon's leading communities, would guide the Republic through its uncertain early years. Prime Minister Riad al-Solh, looking back on the lessons of 1943 and 1945, stressed the importance of continuity and stability. His aim was not to remake Lebanon overnight, but to build institutions strong enough to carry the weight of new independence. President Bechara el-Khoury focused on diplomacy, seeking international partnerships to anchor Lebanon in the changing order of the post-war world. Both leaders knew that the country would not secure its future just by removing foreign troops. It had to define its own character, policies, and direction. Meanwhile, French officials left with mixed feelings. Some believed the withdrawal was a needless concession, forced by outside pressure. Others saw it as the natural end of a mandate system that the Second World War had made outdated. Officers who had spent years in the Levant packed their belongings with a sense of finality. The departure was not only a political shift, but the closing of a personal chapter tied to decades of French presence in the region. By autumn 1946, only a few French units remained. Their daily routine became mostly limited to preparing equipment for shipping and finishing the transfer of facilities. Lebanese officials watched over the process with growing confidence, aware that each departure strengthened their control. International observers noted the calmness of the transition, a contrast to the turmoil that marked the end of colonial rule elsewhere. France, Lebanon, Britain, and the United States all had reasons to avoid unrest, and that shared interest helped bring the process to its end. The final departure came on 31 December 1946. As French troops boarded the last ships at Beirut's harbour, the moment passed without grand speeches or dramatic scenes. The ships moved away from the quay, their outlines fading into the winter light. Onshore, a small group of Lebanese officials watched in silence. No single ceremony could fully show what the withdrawal meant. The end of outside rule, the beginning of full independence, and the challenge of governing a nation still shaping its own identity. In the weeks that followed, Lebanon faced the first tests of life without the mandate. Budget debates returned with new force. Judges worked through cases that might once have required consultation with French officials. The cabinet discussed changes to education, infrastructure, and security. These tasks lacked the drama of the Rashaya crisis, but they carried deeper meaning. They were the everyday, necessary work of a state that now stood on its own. Lebanon had achieved what generations had imagined: recognition, independence, and the freedom to decide its own future. Yet with that freedom came uncertainty. The new republic stood surrounded by shifting regional politics and internal debates that it had delayed during the struggle for independence. The foundations laid between 1943 and 1946 would guide the country through the years ahead, but they also carried tensions that would need careful handling. As the last traces of the mandate faded, Lebanon stepped into a future that was entirely its own, hopeful, delicate, and shaped by the understanding that independence was not the end of its story, but the beginning of the long work of building a nation. Lebanon's long road to independence still echoes in the region's politics today. So share this story with anyone who loves deep, overlooked history. Like and subscribe to help this channel bring more untold World War II and post-war narratives to light. Join the discussion in the comments. What moment from 1943 to 46 do you think changed Lebanon's destiny the most?